I tried my best. Can't have too much fun. Can't have too much fun.
Dr. Jackson is taking your photograph, so everyone smile. If anyone is in the witness protection program, you can talk to me afterwards. Good evening, and welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. It's so great to have all of you here tonight as we gather for the sixth in a series of voices where we bring significant thought leaders, authors, educators, artists to come and be with us and both hearten us, help our hearts to grow and be grounded, and also to challenge us. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Tom Hall and Dr. Larry Jackson. And before I say a word or so about them, let's, if you will, let's have a prayer. Oh God, we thank you for this day, for waking us up this morning and being with us right on through to now. And thank you for helping us to discover again and again that now is the only moment that we have. Thank you for all the gifts that make our lives beautiful and pleasant. And thank you for those hard times that call out the best in us. Be with our speakers tonight and help them to be grounded in their strength and in their story. And we thank you especially that Dr. Jackson brings to us the story, perhaps fleshing out the story of this neighborhood, what it is to be connected to this part of Baltimore, and to know perhaps more fully the parts of our story that many folks have either forgotten or not known. Oh God, we are made whole in you when we know more fully our stories, the good and the bad, the broken pieces of our lives that find their wholeness in you. We pray in the name of the one God. Amen. So Professor Lawrence Jackson earned his PhD in English and American Literature at Stanford University and has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the William J. Fulbright Program. He began his teaching career at Howard University in 1997, and he's now Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University, where he directs the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts. His latest books are Hold It Real Still, Clint Eastwood, Race in the Cinema of the American West, and Shelter, A Black Tale from Homeland, Baltimore. Tom Hall is the host of Midday, the highly rated news and public policy program that airs Monday through Friday at noon on WYPR. Tom is also the host of What Are You Reading, which you can catch on the fourth Friday of the month at 4:44 p.m. And Tom is also an author, contributing articles to the Baltimore Sun and Baltimore Magazine. And he's the co-author of The Bach Passions in Our Time, Contending with the Legacy of Anti-Semitism, published by a friend of this parish, ICJS, the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. So it's my pleasure to present Tom Hall and Dr. Larry Jackson.
Thank you. Good evening. Welcome. It's so great to see everybody here. Just real quick, how many of you live in this neighborhood? How many of you live in Homeland? Good. Terrific. I'm going to immediately turn the floor over to Dr. Jackson.
I just want to say thank you so much to the Roland Park Association and to the Homeland Association and to the Church of the Redeemer. I really am grateful to have my fellow parishioners from St. James and Lafayette Square with us tonight, including my mom. I'm very thankful that the nephew of a dear friend of mine who was murdered in Baltimore, Donald Bentley, Kevin Bentley, is with us tonight. It's a great testament. And also, I just wanted to find out how many Episcopalians in the audience? Yeah. Okay. So, terrific. So, before we get underway, and Tom Hall, if you heard yesterday, right? Like he's really going to put me through my paces to the point where I'm actually tongue-tied. These events have changed over the years, where you sort of really go after the author and find out what they're made of, and you might be surprised, hey, there's nothing there, but
Oh, ye of little faith.
I wanted to read a letter that I came across I guess it was about 6 months ago. So, in the publication of a book like Shelter, which I had more control over the publication of this book than anything else that I've ever written. But nonetheless, the final manuscript, went in by the middle of the summer. And, we've just sort of been waiting for April to come around for the book to come out. And so if I had found this piece of information, I certainly would have figured out a way to have worked it in. This is a letter that was written in 1723. And I'm going to read it pretty swiftly, and I think that especially the Episcopalians in the audience, this will be more than poignant, is how I would put it. August the 4th, 1723. To the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of London, this comes to satisfy your honor that there is in this land of Virginia a sort of people that is called mulattoes, which are baptized and brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and follows the ways and rules of the Church of England, and some of them has white fathers and some white mothers, and there is in this land a law or act which keeps and makes them and their seed slaves forever. And most honored sir, amongst the rest of your charitable acts, indeed, we, your humble and poor parishioners, do beg, sir, your aid and assistance in this one thing, which lies, as I do understand, in your lordship breast, which is that your honor will, by the help of our sovereign Lord King George, and the rest of the rulers, will release us out of this cruel bondage. And this we beg, for Jesus Christ, his sake, who has commanded us to seek first the kingdom of God, and all things shall be added unto us. And here it is to be noted that one brother is a slave to another, and one sister to another, which is quite out of the way. And as for me, myself, I am my brother's slave, but my name is secret. The letter writer actually crossed all of that out, so that's, you getting the raw document. And here it is to be noted again that we are commanded to keep holy the Sabbath day, and we do hardly know when it comes, for our taskmasters are as hard with us as the Egyptian was with the children of Israel. God be merciful unto us. Here follows our severity and sorrowful service. We are hard used upon every account. In the first place, we are in ignorance of our salvation. And in the next place, we are kept out of the church, and matrimony is denied us. And to be plain, they do look no more upon us than if we were dogs, which I hope when these strange lines come to you, your lordship's hands will be looking into. And here we beg for Jesus Christ his sake, that as your honor do hope for the mercy of God at the day of death and the redemption of our Savior Christ, that when this comes to your lordship hands, your honor will take some pity of us who in your humble but sorrowful petitioners, and sir, we your humble petitioners do humbly beg the favor of your lordship, that your honor will grant and settle one thing upon us, which is that our children may be brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and our desire is that they may be learned the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments, and that they may appear every Lord's Day at church before the curate to be examined, for our desire is that God lines should abound among us, and we desire that our children be put to school and learned to read through the Bible, which is all at present with our prayers to God for its good success before your honor, these from your humble servants in the Lord. My writing is very bad. I hope your honor will take the will for the deed. I am but a poor slave that rid it and has no other time but Sunday, and hardly that at some times. September the 8th, 1723, to the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of London, these with care. We dare not subscribe any man's name to this, for fear of our masters, for if they knew that we have sent home to your honor, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree. I just wanted to open with that. I find that missive, utterly remarkable, and I'm maybe one of a few people that thinks a great deal about, hey, what was Virginia like in the 1720s? Roughly between 1715 and 1750 in the Chesapeake region. The historical accounts or the records of the transatlantic slave trade would suggest that like 37,500 or so people come directly from the modern-day Igbo lands in Nigeria, from Calabar and Port Harcourt, and that it's a significant Igbo presence that will be, in some ways, coming to characterize the Chesapeake. But the writers of the letter, tell us that they also are people of mixed race, biracial Americans, though this is before, obviously this is in colonial times. And part of what I'm interested in Shelter, is making that connection back to that lineage. And in the process of doing some of the research and writing, we are in the Church of the Redeemer that was donated by the family of David Malden Perrine shortly before his death, and the family of David Malden Perrine. But that in the course of this research, one of the things that was fascinating, again, just a bit of information for my Episcopalian brethren and sistren, in my mother's side of the family, we have an ancestor who was a freed person in 1860 and who bought a great portion of land relative to the kinds of land dealings that freed people had in Southern Virginia at that time. And they built an Episcopal church, or that was one of the things that took place. I think it's St. Philip's Church, but it's in the book, so you quote the book, don't quote the person of poor memory up on the altar. This is my first time up here, boy, and I'm just sort of like, this is fantastic. This is really something. But, I wanted to share that with you. I feel like that letter also captures some of the central contradictions, and like I said, it's beyond poignant. Some of the central pain, the punitive dimension of the relationship across the color line, and maybe also especially connected to our church and the church's legacy, the church of the landholders, the Church of England, or the church that reformed itself after the Revolution. And the book really also is wrestling with what would be the, not just our own legacy and heritage, but what is the responsibility that we have in terms of, the future. So anyway, I thought I would begin there with your blessing. Thank you.
It is very powerful, this letter, and you have such facilities, such a gift for, number one, finding these documents, and number two, mining them for not just what they say, but what they mean. And that's a gift of only a really talented historian. How do you approach those documents that are, particularly the old ones? I mean, because this book, you're commenting on the uprising of 2015. You're commenting on Congressman Elijah Cummings. You're commenting on all sorts of contemporary things, but also Frederick Douglass and even people who preceded him. Talk about your approach to that.
Yeah, I am a dilettante historian, right? Not do not have a PhD from Stanford, from the Department of History, like my esteemed colleagues, across the globe. And the people who are in the fields of languages and literature definitely take considerably more license with everything, sort of that comes across the desk. In fact, I have really an eminent colleague in New York now, somebody whose profile is in New Yorker magazine, right? That's when you know, don't approach me on the street when I have my New Yorker profile, right? And she's coined a term, the scholar's name is Saidiya Hartman.
I love her.
Yeah, she's coined the term critical fabulation, right? So that's what she does with history. I mean, she takes the same license as Toni Morrison. Though, again, I would say that I am definitely dilettantish. I don't feel quite that comfortable. I have a method of, again, as a person who has spent most of their time, writing biography, which, is to cast a broad net, but especially to find the archives. And in this case, I had a point of view from, again, mainly my mom's family. My dad is a migrant from Roanoke who moved to Baltimore in the early 1950s to go to Morgan State University. But my mother's family has a longer history that includes McCullough Street and Myrtle Avenue. My grandfather's cousin is here. And, I have sort of a, the terrible phrase people say is that the DNA is in me. But anyway, the DNA of West Baltimore is a huge part of my being. So I could draw on some, sort of family stories and places to turn a stone. But the great beauty, in my own case, of teaching at Johns Hopkins was that, you immediately become aware of and start thinking about, well, what's in the special collections here? The frontispiece to the book Shelter is like my favorite photograph of all time, and it actually shows the laborers, the common laborers who were taking down the forest when they set up the roads and began to dig out the foundations for the houses. And even though this is taking place in the early 1920s, and when they did a lot of the formal road work, they were using tractors. I mean, basically pretty close to the road machines that are operative today. But nonetheless, the men were using axes and two-man hand saws, and they carted most of the tree and debris in horse-drawn wagons. In other words, they used the same techniques that had been used for thousands of years. And so that's also a remarkable, or sort of an entry point for me, just like relative to the way that my imagination, maybe my historical imagination might be stimulated. You're at this point in the 1920s of the advent of urbanization, industrialization, but also this really incredible moment of modernism. The machine in the garden, so to speak, and we wouldn't be going back in some formidable ways, and there is a real break that occurs. And, that made me think about, so many of our local figures. I tried to figure out a way to sort of bend F. Scott Fitzgerald into this because, he's just sort of up the street on the cut that goes through the middle of Towson University campus off of Stevenson. And H.L. Mencken, of course, who is, West Baltimorean, though Holland Square, and, I'm like Lafayette Square a couple miles north. But these places of entree, I just wanted to dig a little deeper. And as you know, in the there's a really a loving, I think also a complicated chapter on Frederick Douglass in the book. But the achievement, I suppose, of Frederick Douglass and Billie Holiday after returning to Baltimore in 2016, they came alive to me in a way that they just had never been before. And I suppose, like as a child, I mentioned this, Matthew Henson was the figure that I thought, as a young person, was so extraordinary, right? It's like the Marco Polo, the black Marco Polo or something. And I just, I don't know, I guess I thought of Douglass as just giving these speeches, what I mean? And my mother went to Frederick Douglass, and, my, a lot of the other relatives, they went to Frederick Douglass. And, he was sort of the person who was, sort of, right at hand and also quite ancient. But in the process of the return, it has made me think or to want to labor a bit more with some of our local figures. And I would also say this, I mean, and this is maybe where I am less of a dilettante and more of a professional historian. I was quite disappointed with the professional historians' accounts of Douglass's life in Baltimore and Holiday's life in Baltimore. Now, of course, I think there are multiple reasons. I mean, most people want to move the story from, the world of the teenager or the world of the adolescent, and sort of get them to, making records in Holiday's case, or the lion of the abolitionist movement in Douglass's case. But I wanted to know more about them and their lives in the city, and in the process of trying to recover some of the information, or just to be able to line out really the pathways that they took in their day-to-day lives. I'm into maps, and digital maps, I suppose. But I felt like the black communities that produced both of the figures, and again, these are not well-to-do communities, but that nonetheless they had a profound and amazing, a really significant impact on the beauty of their art, on Douglass's intellect. And Douglass had black figures in this city who he absolutely could have used as models in the abolitionist movement. Holiday, even though a very, very young person, 12, 13 years old, had similar icons in the jazz world who were right here and local. And so I wanted to do some digging, and it, you spread around and try to get to it.
You write so movingly about the history of this place and this neighborhood, about St. James, Lafayette Square, and about that area, which is in Harlem Park on the west side. I was intrigued by so many things in this book. One of the things that intrigued me perhaps the most is when you talk about black history. You say the black past is one to be protected from. The rescinded, mortuaried heritage is a serial problem of all of our generations. The need to cut off our place and our time.
Yeah, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is the filmmaker Marlon Riggs. You used to use the saying "black is, black ain't" all the time. I mean, other people than just Riggs. Ralph Ellison, of course, for me is a foundational figure in this way, that the blackness of blackness is, again, the prologue from Invisible Man. It is most black. It is also like this tale about the tar baby and Brer Rabbit, and Brer Rabbit seeking recognition from this amorphous, inanimate blob, and getting himself stuck in something that could possibly prove deadly, and then at the same time using some other resources to extricate himself partially from the blackness of blackness. But the point that I'm trying to draw attention to there is that when slavery and segregation and the associated traumas with those events, some people today I think would say with those systems, those logics of human existence and of philosophical being, being in the world, borrowing from the existentialist, I guess, but that when you account for the operation of this sort of dehumanizing kind of system over time, it is one that even if it's incredibly important to know what happened in the past, it's also something that can be destructive to you in the present. I went to college. I had read on my own, because my parents had the book, I had read portions of the autobiography of Malcolm X. I had read portions of Man-Child in the Promised Land. I was familiar with Richard Wright's Black Boy, and maybe I had read portions of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. But when I got to college, it was, the cornucopia of Black Studies classes at Wesleyan University in 1986. And, I immediately said, oh my gosh, this is this thing that has been kept away from me. And boy, I'm going to major in African American Studies. And at the same time, it was a moment that, it was a 180-degree turn for me from, I suppose, maybe like, to use one example, like feelings of patriotism towards the nation state that had been an incredibly strong part of my life up to that moment. And all of a sudden, the questioning, the criticism, the disgust, and the anger, was also palpable. I mean, everybody that I grew up with would always say, oh, you went to college and you came back and you changed, and, you're thinking about things differently and you look at things differently. And that is definitely true. But, again, it is this past that's so difficult. Sometimes I feel like I'm a poor pedagogue, or, not particularly like lockstep in a philosophical or political sense. I have these conversations with my sons all the time. My 17-year-old is a new driver in Baltimore. When I was 17 and a driver in Baltimore, I had, one of the most horrifying experiences of my own life. I don't know, they have some kind of term for it, but anyway, the undercover policeman accused me of stealing the car, and when they do that, they treat you like you have stolen the car, and so, they're like threatening to kill you. And I just thought it was like some random people who had, sort of stopped us on the street and were trying to steal the car. We very easily could have been killed. I was with my two closest friends from, my neighborhood. Lived next door to me. And, so I want to protect my son from that experience. So, like, from the time, as soon as he could understand, I've been talking to him about, sort of race and blackness and masculinity in America, in a prophylactic sense. But then in another way, right?
The talk, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. But though I would say that ours is less of a singular event or moment. The talk is the life, is the way that I would, maybe think about it. But then on the other hand, I very much have not wanted to destroy his innocence, and I have not wanted him to feel like, things aren't worth striving for, maybe especially that sir and ma'am are worth striving for, or cleaning up your bedroom. Maybe it's like the main thing. It's number one, number two, number three, number four. And there is that's also another, I think, part of the challenge or the problem. Anybody who wants to know about my own situation, my mother's here in the audience, you can ask her. Hey, what was going on in your house, Verno? But in the house that I am in charge of today, it is something that we are, facing or, facing down all of the time. I would very much like for Black history and the Black story to be an empowering one, and I suppose that's why in the book I try to, wherever it's possible, and some of it is tongue-in-cheek, or most of it's probably tongue-in-cheek, but I try to call out the depth as much as I'm aware of, and again, I've already announced that I'm a dilettante, so the depth of the African experience. Certainly for me, one of the great powerful moments of my own life was being able to live in West Africa and have the children enrolled in school there. I feel like even though, to them it's sort of like, oh, the president was Barack Obama, right? Anything is possible.
We
right?
got this, Dad.
America's
Yeah.
a great place, right? But in the back of their mind, when Nathaniel was 8 and Mitchell was 5, I know that they have, a social experience that just accepts them and embraces them just like across the board. And then they're browner people than I am. And so maybe, we had a slightly different social experience, but it was just fascinating to me to see the way that they would, jump on the back of the moto. Everybody travels in West Africa on these motorcycles. You're like, man, it's completely dangerous. Don't do this, don't do this. Jump on the back of the moto, go to the market, and, and everybody's like, hey, Mitchell would always accuse me of not being properly Ivorian because I didn't eat with my hands and, that kind of thing.
You mentioned driving. I wonder, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but on page 105, could you read us a section from the book? We didn't talk about what you might want to read or not. You've read that beautiful letter, but on page 105, the paragraph that it, because it gives a bit of the history of your automotive life.
Yeah, you picked a real zinger, Tom. Yeah, that's great. Although we get the car on the road after 9:20, we make most of our lights with only mild tailgating, and after I cut the red light at North Avenue, I'm angling onto Gold Street and then coasting the speed bumps on Division Street in fine time. I drive creatively, in the way that I would dance, and forever take the road less traveled, the alley and the ditched gully, over the surface road with its stoplight. Motion is my principle because I mastered the automobile in trials of mounting peril. I took my driver's test on a condemned 1971 Beetle, and the state trooper failed me when the shock spring tore through the rusted cargo compartment housing. An inoperable door handle on the American Motor Company Hornet once saved me from a street beating. I achieved race car speeds on the tight streets off Walbrook Junction to flee drug dealers who smashed the windshield of the car. Sleep deprivation begat a headlong collision on Dukeland. I kept the wheel steadier than I did my bladder when assaulted by undercover police detectives. I turned the then rare wheelchair access of a sidewalk into a passing lane for a service van in the rain. Wrapping the front end of my best friend's Dodge Colt around a chain, spinning a two-wheel drive truck through the snow into the rail, rear-ending a sedan jumping in front to turn, carjacked by the brigands in the Old West End, swerving on the highway to foil the sheet of airborne metal slicing toward the windshield.
There's some unfunny stuff in there.
Absolutely.
But there's some really funny stuff in there, too. And I hope your son doesn't read that page with his new license.
Yeah.
We're in church, so I want to talk about these two churches that figure so prominently in the book. Let's start with St. James Lafayette Square, which I was just personally delighted to read about because, as we talked about this yesterday, one of my best friends, Maurice Murphy, was the choir master and organist there. And many of the singers, Yvette Matthews, Janetta Jones, these are names that are familiar to some of the St. James folks. Dear folks, because in my other life I was a musician. I also played a bunch of concerts here, but so both of these places were places that figured prominently in my work prior to doing this radio thing. Let's talk about Black Episcopalians. You say that they have an important role to play. We are the people of reason, the readers, the break
against the army of Methodist and Baptist passion and autonomy. How many Methodists in the audience? I mean, but that is a great take on the Black Episcopal Church.
Yeah, you definitely found the great zingers in there. Tom, this is good. This is good. Yeah, so, sure, I mean, boy, we have so many jokes. I mean, not just Black Episcopalians, right? I mean, all of the Episcopalians. And, I suppose the umbrella here to this, of course, is, declining religious worship in the United States across the globe, except in sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and Latin America, right? Where is Christianity a part of day-to-day life? And, how can we, sort of make the argument that what we're doing is valuable and makes sense? And I just want to call attention to the fact that in a city like Baltimore, I mean, and of course it has a great deal to do with, how you are understanding the role of the Church of England and the Episcopal Church after the Revolution and its response to, John Wesley and the evangelical movement of the Great Awakening and the evangelical movement of the later 18th century. But in a place like Baltimore, where the Episcopal Church is actually going to, or Black Episcopalians connected to Old St. Paul's, will be requesting a minister and will receive, this guy who's from New York and he's trained in Philadelphia, and will get the approval of Maryland's bishop to set up the first Black church below the Mason-Dixon line, the first Black Episcopalian church. And that this would be the church, just as an example, that basically is going to be organized by one of the families that will produce the first African American graduate of Harvard University. Jacob Greener's grandson, Richard T. Greener, will be the first Black Harvard graduate, and that kind of intellectual leadership or intellectual achievement, let's just say. It shouldn't be forgotten or lost or gainsaid. You all help me, not my catechist, but anyway, when I was in confirmation class, the teacher was Dr. Eugene Ford. I called him Dr. Ford every day that I knew him, and it's not until, 40 years later that I learned that he too, right, is graduated from Harvard in the 1920s or the early 1930s. I mean, in other words, a really exceptional and extraordinary Black man. I don't know if he was originally from Baltimore, lived in Baltimore his whole time. There are some strong benefits, I would say, that come from the liturgical tradition. I mean, we we believe that the service should follow, sort of the printed document, and you're constantly referring to the book for the prayers, and many people think that we're quite rigid. The first elected Black bishop of the Episcopal Church happens to come from St. James, or began his career at the St. James Church, Bishop Michael Curry. So in my own experience, Michael Curry is going to be the first person that I ever hear in a church talking about the wisdom of the spirituals. Now, this is before I'm reading somebody like W.B. Du Bois. And I encourage everybody to read Du Bois on their own, or sort of come to Du Bois on your own terms. But I would just say that it's really only since the amazing popularity of the biographies written by David Levering Lewis that we embrace Du Bois as an American intellectual, sort of across the board. In the 1980s, before that those books were finished or published, I think that Du Bois was, still very much a figure that was known primarily to African Americans, and then maybe some people on the far left, because obviously he dies in Ghana as a member of the Communist Party. But anyway, the emphasis on African American culture in my own case, and some of the connections that were made between what was taking place in the church and what was taking place with intellectual life, it's coming at the hands of a Yale-trained minister. And you mentioned Maurice Murphy. Boy, did I had the incredible fortune to have asked him, in my own way, about the nature of some of the music that was going on in the church, and write about, one of our anthems, our Christmas anthems. I mean, I don't think it's been sung in a couple of years, but anyway, one of the spirituals that I feel like we maybe have elevated and taken to its highest rank, or its highest form of articulation. In other words, a Clara Ward, who is a gospel singer, right? A Clara Ward song being performed by, like an eminently trained musical conductor, choir conductor, and organist and composer, Maurice Murphy, and where you would also have people who have operatic quality voices, sort of bringing the spirituals into the maybe what we might think of as the heights of sort of the Episcopal Church. But I find that those traditions, I would like to see them preserved. I would also like to see them magnified. I think that it's important for us as a larger Baltimore community that while we know that there are places where we have to have celebration and ecstasy and not the narcotic, but celebration and moments of ecstatic joy, but then there are also moments where we need highly cerebral reflection. I think that's the only way that we can get through, is with a particular kind of balance. I'm not trying to suggest that it's the exclusive provenance of the Episcopal Church. It's not. But that there certainly had been a tradition in Baltimore. The crowning figure for us is Father George F. Bragg, who was born in slavery and in North Carolina, and then grew up and attended school in Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg was a very important place in the middle of the 19th century, or immediately after the Civil War, for Black Americans. He grows up in a church that is founded by one of the adjuncts of Robert E. Lee, and these men that were with Lee, and you might consider David Malden Perrine in some, more or less. I mean, as a person that was also with Lee, they did not support. It's a little bit complicated, right? I mean, were they comfortable ultimately with emancipation, but they certainly never would have imagined something like black equality, but nonetheless, participated in the creation of some black schools. And Bragg was also a figure who was trying to bend white philanthropy toward the service of not black uplift, I would say, but in some ways many more basic tasks, like the ending of sort of utter destitution and black poverty. When Johns Hopkins created his will, he hoped to have a permanent orphanage and a permanent training school for African Americans. And, as you can imagine, it's because the situation is so extreme in the city after the Civil War. It's probably extreme before the Civil War, and it's also in conversation with some prominent African Americans here in the city. It's always worthwhile to remember that Baltimore produces a Medal of Honor winner, Christian Fleetwood, who's distinguished in the Civil War. But there were prominent blacks after the Civil War. And Bragg very much wanted to see these projects continued. They were not. By the end of the end of the teens, by the mid-20s, both the orphanage and the training school, had closed their doors. Bragg is one of the last ministers to have taken communion, to the young women who were in the training school. But I'll just turn to Ralph Ellison. Ellison always argued that the 19th century Americans, especially American writers and intellectuals, had a significantly stronger sense of ethical responsibility for the nation state, and that by the time you get to the early part of the 20th century or the middle of the 20th century, that feeling of the world that we have in common had been lost and erased.
By the way, Michael Curry, for those of you who didn't know him and his connection to Baltimore at St. James, was the person who presided at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. and he was going to preside at your wedding, and he canceled on you. That's rough.
Man, I mean, I just could not offer this guy Buckingham Palace as I mean, the hors d'oeuvres outside, they were just not going to be like Buckingham Palace.
This wasn't his speed.
Quality,
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
Just,
So let's talk a little bit about this church. I did not know, and I read in your book, that services on Sunday mornings are at 10 o'clock here at Church of the Redeemer. Is that right? And this is the only church in the diocese allowed to meet at that hour. How did you find that out? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that one is, that one's open to the public.
Everybody
Maybe I
knows it.
asked the bishop. I don't
Ask the bishop, those are, if I can track him down. But the land for this church was part of the David Malden Perrine
Yeah.
universe.
Yeah, so it's 250 acres, more or less from the contemporary Notre Dame College. Not as far. I mean, I don't know if I don't think it's as far as Lake Avenue. I think it's probably just about 2 blocks beyond. I don't know the name of the cross street. I'm sure everybody knows the name of the cross street that's right here. But the Church of the Redeemer, the stone is supposed to have been quarried, right at the southwest corner there of Northern Parkway in Charles. The ponds, or what we call the lakes in Homeland, those were dug very early on, and it's supposed to have this remarkable water that the Perrine family would have. Their house on, they lived on Liberty Street, or they had a townhouse on Liberty Street,